Her hands, weathered by pain, caressed the dry earth as one caresses the forehead of a loved one. Her father's death had left Rosie with nothing but memories and a house about to vanish, like tears in the rain. In the silence of her solitude, he appeared, with eyes that had seen too much death but now sought life, a stranger who bought her land for $5, only to return it with a promise whispered among the reviving cornfield. If this redemption story touched your heart, leave us your like, as one leaves flowers on the grave of a memory that is reborn. And tell us, how do you think this love story will end between two broken souls seeking to heal together under the same sky? The sun fell like a sentence over Dustwater, a forgotten spot on the map of Millbrook County, Texas. The streets raised sighs of dust beneath the worn boots of Cole Travers, who entered the town like a silent shadow, with the weight of his 35 years marked in the premature wrinkles that framed his amber eyes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that partially concealed his face, a 3-day beard, and a past he preferred to keep buried in the deserts he had crossed. The sheriff's office smelled of rancid tobacco and old papers when Cole pushed the door. The sound of wood against rusted hinges caused the man seated behind the desk to look up wearily. "I'm looking for information about the lay-low of lands," said Cole, his voice rough like stone against stone. The sheriff, a man with drooping mustaches and eyes narrowed by years of suspicion, examined him without disguise. "At the end of the street, building with a flag, but there's not much left worth taking." Cole nodded without offering more words. Long conversations had never been his strength. He preferred silence, where lies couldn't form and memories remained. Controlled, like wild animals in cages too small, the lay-low turned out to be a pathetic gathering of desperate men looking for opportunities in barren land. Cole remained leaning against the back wall, watching as properties sold for ridiculous amounts. When Parcel 27 was mentioned, an abandoned rural property with a ruined house, something stirred within him. The auction began at $10, and due to lack of interest quickly descended. $5, Cole offered, his voice emerging from nowhere like lightning in a clear sky. The auctioneer, a man in a bright vest with a sweaty face, seemed surprised that anyone would offer anything for that forgotten land. $5 going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back. Cole felt the weight of the deed in his rough hands. $5 for a piece of land. $5 for what could be a beginning, or perhaps an end. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts, sharpened by years of survival, whispered that this impulsive purchase had some purpose he couldn't yet comprehend. That night, as he slept under the stars on the outskirts of Dustwater, he dreamed of green fields and a different kind of silence than the one that had accompanied him for so many years. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. Dawn painted the sky in copper tones when Cole rode toward his new property. As he approached, he could make out the contours of a small house with a wooden porch, a barn leaning as if about to surrender to gravity, and acres of dry land where crops must once have grown. The sun had barely begun to rise over the horizon when he saw her, a slender figure on the porch with an old shotgun pointed directly at his chest. The first thing he noticed were her eyes, dark and deep like wells where a mixture of wounded pride and unshakable determination was reflected. "This land is not abandoned," she said in Spanish, though she quickly switched to English with a slight accent. "This land has owners." Cole stopped his horse at a prudent distance, without making sudden movements. The woman seemed no more than 20 years old, but her hands held the weapon with the firmness of someone who had learned too early that the world is not a safe place. "I have the papers," he replied calmly, without dismounting. "I bought this property yesterday." The young woman's eyes flashed with indignation. The wind played with her black hair, long and gathered in a disheveled braid. She wore a simple dress, patched in several places, and her hands showed the marks of someone who works the land without rest. "The bank stole this land from my father," she replied, her voice as firm as her hands on the shotgun. "He got sick, we lost the harvest, and they didn't wait. $5? Is that what you paid? This land is worth in tears much more than all the gold in Texas." Cole remained motionless, observing her. There was something about her, in her dignified posture despite the circumstances, that resonated with something deep inside him. It wasn't just her natural beauty, wild like the desert flowers that survive against all odds. It was that indomitable dignity that he had seen disappear in so many men over the years. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Rosie Delgado," she replied, without lowering the weapon. "My father is in the back room. He lost a leg to diabetes, but he can shoot if necessary." Cole dismounted slowly, showing his palms in a universal gesture of peace. "Cole Travers," he introduced himself. "I didn't come to throw you out. In fact—" He hesitated, the words forming in his mind like an unexpected but perfectly clear idea. "This land is yours. I just need a place to stay for a while. We can come to an agreement." The shotgun lowered just a few inches as confusion crossed Rosie's face like a passing cloud. "What kind of agreement?" she asked suspiciously. "I'll return the property to you without charging anything. I just want to be able to stay here, help recover the land. Maybe find some peace." He said the last part more to himself than to her, but the words hung in the air between them, like an invisible bridge stretched over an abyss of distrust. The first days were an awkward dance of tense silences and cautious glances. Rosie had accepted the deal reluctantly, more out of necessity than trust. Her father, Ernesto Delgado, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much, watched Cole from his bedroom window, like a sentinel waiting for the first sign of betrayal. Cole respected that distrust. He understood it better than anyone. He began working from dawn, repairing fallen fences, reinforcing the barn roof that threatened to collapse with the next storm. He worked in silence, methodically, as if each nail he hammered was a silent prayer, a form of penance for sins he didn't mention. At night he slept in the barn on a pile of hay, rejecting Rosie's offer to use a small room in the house. He preferred the sound of the wind slipping between the boards and the distant company of the stars. They reminded him that the world was much bigger than his mistakes. It was during the morning of the 6th day when something changed. Cole was trying to repair the water pump that had broken down years before, his hands struggling with rusted mechanisms under the relentless midday sun. "You're doing it wrong," said Rosie, appearing like a silent apparition beside him. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation with him. She carried a bucket with fresh water and a dampened cloth that she offered without words. Cole accepted it, wiping the sweat and dirt from his face. The simple, unexpected gesture contained an intimacy that he found disconcerting. "My father. He used to make it work," she continued, kneeling beside the pump. "You have to loosen this part first." Her small but strong hands moved with precision among the mechanisms. Cole watched fascinated as she disassembled parts that he had been forcing. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "When you grow up in a land that constantly tries to kill you with thirst or hunger, you learn to talk to machines, to the earth," she replied without stopping her work. "My mother died when I was 12. Since then I had to be my father's eyes, hands, and eventually his legs." The pump emitted a metallic sound, and after a few more adjustments began to extract water. The crystalline liquid gushed like a tangible miracle, forming a small rainbow as it was crossed by the sun's rays. Rosie smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face, softening the hard edges that life had carved into her. Cole felt something strange in his chest, as if a tiny seed had been planted in ground he believed forever infertile. That night, for the first time, they ate together. Ernesto joined them at the kitchen table, his amputated leg discreetly covered with a blanket despite the heat. The food was simple: beans, handmade tortillas, and coffee. But there was something ceremonial in the way Rosie set the table, placing a small vase with wildflowers in the center. "Why are you really here?" asked Ernesto, his tired eyes fixed on Cole. "A man doesn't buy dead land and then give it away." Cole chewed slowly before answering, searching for words for a truth that even he didn't fully understand. "I've spent a lot of time taking," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to give something back." "Are you a fugitive?" Ernesto's question was direct, without adornment. "No," Cole replied, holding his gaze. "The law isn't looking for me, but there are ghosts that do." Rosie, who had remained silent, intervened. "Ghosts can't cross running water," she said, gesturing toward the repaired pump. "My grandmother used to say that. Maybe that's why you're here." Her words, simple and superstitious, contained a truth that resonated with Cole more than he was willing to admit. That night, before retiring to the barn, he took from his saddlebag a small object wrapped in a worn handkerchief, a silver pocket watch, the only possession he kept from his father. He silently left it on the kitchen table, like an offering to gods he wasn't sure he believed in. The next morning the watch had disappeared, but in its place he found a small figure carved in wood, a horse in full gallop, with surprisingly precise details despite the simplicity of the carving. Cole held it between his rough fingers, recognizing the gesture for what it was, the first tentative step towards a shared language. The weeks began to unravel like a ball of wool rolling downhill, each day more fluid than the last. The June sun scorched the earth, but Cole and Rosie worked tirelessly, preparing the soil for a possible fall planting. There was something rhythmic, almost meditative in the way their bodies synchronized in physical work, anticipating each other's needs without the need for words. Cole learned to read the sky as Rosie did, looking for signs of rain in distant clouds that for him before would have been meaningless white spots. She, in turn, found herself admiring the methodical way he approached each task, his quiet efficiency, so different from the desperation with which she had tried to keep the land productive during the last few years. One afternoon, as they repaired the north fence together, Rosie observed Cole's hands. Large, calloused hands with scars that told stories his lips didn't share. Hands that now planted posts in the earth with a gentleness incongruous with their strength. "Your hands aren't a farmer's," she said, breaking the shared silence. "They have other stories." Cole drove another post before responding, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky merged with the earth in a diffuse line. "I've had many lives," he finally replied. "None that I'm proud of." Rosie nodded, as if that cryptic answer had revealed more to her than the words actually said. She didn't press. She had learned that with Cole, as with parched earth, patience was the key. Water that falls too quickly on arid soil simply runs off without penetrating. It's the soft, persistent drizzle that revives the land. It might rain. "Tonight," she commented, changing the subject as she looked westward, where dark clouds were beginning to form. "The toads sang last night." Cole smiled slightly. It was the first time Rosie had seen his smile reach his eyes, momentarily softening the hard lines of his face. "Do toads predict rain?" "My mother said they do," she replied, a shadow of sadness crossing her face at the mention of her mother. "She also said that when the wind changes just before nightfall, the spirits are restless." "And are they?" "The spirits?" Rosie looked at him intensely, as if evaluating whether he was mocking her beliefs. Finding no mockery, only genuine curiosity, she relaxed. "All places have their own spirits. This land has seen much suffering, but it has also known love." She paused, her fingers playing with a small medallion that hung from her neck. "Sometimes I think it speaks to me." "What does it say?" "Lately," she hesitated, a subtle blush coloring her cheeks. "Lately it says there is hope." Cole didn't respond, but he felt something inside him loosen, like a knot tensed for years that was beginning very slowly to untie. That night, the storm that Rosie had predicted arrived with unleashed fury. Lightning illuminated the small house like instant photographs of time, freezing moments in blinding light. Cole abandoned the barn to help secure the windows of the main house. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing off a section of the barn roof. They ended up all three in the kitchen, illuminated by the trembling light of oil lamps. Ernesto, more talkative than usual, shared stories of when the land gave abundant harvests, of how he had met Rosie's mother during a harvest festival in a nearby town. Rosie listened with bright eyes, as if those stories were water for her thirsty soul. Cole observed father and daughter, feeling simultaneously an intruder and part of something precious. The rain pounded the roof furiously, but inside those fragile walls existed a warmth that didn't come from the fire in the stove. When the storm finally subsided, in the early hours, Cole prepared to return to the barn, but Rosie stopped him with a gesture. "The roof is damaged," she said. "You can use the small room." This time Cole didn't reject the offer. That night he slept under a solid roof, wrapped in the scent of dried herbs that hung in bunches from the beams, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking of old wood, Ernesto's soft snores, and Rosie's occasional murmur, talking in her sleep in rapid, melodious Spanish that he couldn't understand but that somehow he found comforting. The next morning, the world seemed washed, renewed. The air smelled of wet earth and possibilities. Cole found Rosie on the porch, contemplating small green shoots that had emerged as if by magic in what previously seemed dead earth. "Dormant seeds," she explained, kneeling to touch the tiny stems with reverence. They were waiting for the right rain. Cole knelt beside her, his fingers accidentally brushing Rosie's as he touched one of the sprouts. Neither of them immediately withdrew their hand. In that moment of simple contact, both felt that something else was germinating, as fragile and promising as those miraculous seeds. Summer advanced with giant steps, each day longer and hotter than the last. July arrived with an overwhelming heat that seemed to melt the horizon into trembling waves. Cole and Rosie established a routine. They worked from dawn until the sun reached its zenith, rested during the hottest hours, and resumed their labors when the temperature began to decline. It was during one of those midday rests when Ernesto, sitting in the shade of the porch with his amputated leg extended before him like a silent accusation against fate, began to cough violently. It wasn't the first time Cole had witnessed these attacks, but this one seemed different, deeper, more desperate. Rosie appeared immediately from the kitchen, her face transformed by fear. Cole observed how she held her father, how she whispered, reassuring words in Spanish while helping him drink water, how she tenderly cleaned the blood that stained his graying beard. There was in her movements an intimacy born of shared pain, a terrible knowledge that this had happened before and would happen again. When Ernesto finally calmed down and Rosie helped him return to his room, Cole remained on the porch, motionless, feeling a helplessness he hadn't experienced in years. He had faced armed men without blinking, had survived ambushes and journeys through merciless deserts, but faced with the illness consuming Ernesto, he felt disarmed, useless. Rosie returned to the porch an hour later, her face marked by fatigue and a resignation that seemed too heavy for her young shoulders. "He's resting," she said, sitting on the steps beside Cole. "How long—" he began, not knowing how to formulate the question. "How long does he have left?" she completed, her voice surprisingly firm. "The doctor from Dustwater says maybe until winter, maybe less." Cole nodded, unable to find words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow. "That's why the land means so much," continued Rosie, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's the only thing that will remain of him, of us. When I was a child, he used to tell me that our roots were intertwined with those of the trees he planted when he married my mother." A silence extended between them, not uncomfortable but contemplative, like the silence that follows a prayer. "My father also died sick," Cole finally said, the words emerging from some deep place he thought sealed forever. "I couldn't be there." It was the first time he had voluntarily shared something of his past. Rosie looked at him, really looked at him, as if she were seeing a new facet of him. "Where were you?" "Far away." "Too far away," he replied, his voice rough. "Working for a man who paid me well to do things that—" He stopped, the words stuck in his throat. Rosie waited, giving him space to continue or to fall silent. When it became evident he would say no more, she simply nodded. "Sometimes I think the dead watch over us," she said, "not as ghosts that frighten, but as witnesses, silent witnesses to our lives." "I hope not," muttered Cole, his gaze lost in some distant point. "There are things I would prefer my father hadn't seen." Rosie extended her hand and, in a gesture that surprised them both, placed it on Cole's. Her touch was warm, rough from work, real in a way that made Cole's heart race. "I think they see what they need to see," she said, with a wisdom that transcended her youth. "Love survives shame." They remained that way, hands joined, until the sun began its descent, and the shadows lengthened like memories stretching toward the future. They didn't speak further, but something fundamental had changed between them. They had shared wounds, and in that sharing they had begun to heal. That night, Cole took from his travel bag something he hadn't touched in weeks, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He contemplated it for a long time in the moonlight that filtered through the cracks of the repaired barn. Then, with a decisive movement, he unscrewed the cap and poured the contents onto the thirsty earth. The amber liquid disappeared quickly, absorbed by the soil like tears in a desert. August arrived with electrical storms that illuminated the night sky as if ancient gods were waging battles above their heads. The earth drank gratefully, and the small shoots that had appeared after the first storm now formed a pale green mantle that extended in irregular patches across the property. Cole, who had never cultivated anything in his life, discovered a deep satisfaction in observing how the earth responded to their care. Each morning, he went out before dawn to check the nascent crops, marveling at the silent miracle of growth. Sometimes he found Rosie already there, kneeling among the sprouts, whispering words full of encouragement to them in Spanish, as if they were children who needed guidance. One morning, as they worked side by side weeding a newly sown sector with corn seeds that Rosie had jealously saved from the last harvest, Cole noticed that she was singing softly. It was a simple, repetitive melody, with words in Spanish that spoke of rain, earth, and hope. Without realizing it, he began to hum along with her, his deep voice naturally harmonizing with Rosie's. She stopped, surprised, and then smiled. Isni was one of those rare and precious smiles that transformed her face, illuminating it from within. "I didn't know you sang," she said. "I don't," he replied, suddenly self-conscious. "At least, not in a long time." "Hey, you should do it more," she said simply, and resumed her song. Cole found himself following her again, their voices intertwining like the roots of the plants they tended, creating something new and beautiful in its simplicity. That same day, they returned to the house for lunch. Rosie stopped abruptly on the path. Cole followed the direction of her gaze and saw what had caught her attention, a rattlesnake coiled a few meters away, its body forming a perfect spiral, the triangular, head raised in a defensive attitude. With a fluid movement born of years of practice, Cole positioned himself between Rosie and the reptile. His hand instinctively sought the revolver he no longer carried, a ghost of his previous life. Instead, he slowly took a rake they had been using. "Don't move," he murmured to Rosie, without taking his eyes off the snake. "Don't kill it," Rosie's voice was an urgent whisper behind him. "It's just scared." Cole looked at her over his shoulder, surprised. The snake emitted a threatening rattle. "It can kill us," he said. "Only if we corner it," Rosie replied. "My grandmother said that snakes are messengers between worlds. Killing them brings bad luck." Cole hesitated, the rake suspended in the air. Part of him, the part forged in years of reacting to danger with immediate violence, screamed to eliminate the threat. But another part, one that seemed to be slowly awakening since he arrived at that land, listened to Rosie's words. With slow, calculated movements, he used the rake to create an escape route for the snake, directing it away from them without harming it. The reptile, after a moment of indecision, slithered toward the bushes and disappeared. Rosie exhaled the breath she had been holding and looked at Cole with a mixture of relief and something else, something warm that made his heart take a strange leap. "Thank you," she said simply. That thank you contained much more than gratitude for having driven away the snake. It was gratitude for having listened, for having respected her beliefs, for having chosen life over death. A choice that Cole suspected he had not made enough in his past. That afternoon, while Rosie prepared dinner, Cole went out to the shed where they kept the tools. He took a piece of ash wood that he had set aside days earlier and began to carve it with his knife. He was not an artist, but his hands knew wood, knew how to reveal the forms hidden within it. He worked until the light faded, guided only by touch and memory. When he finished, he held in his hands a carved snake, its body forming a perfect circle, the symbol of eternity. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it had an honesty that compensated for its technical imperfections. During dinner, he silently placed the figure next to Rosie's plate. She took it in her fingers, examining it carefully, running over the roughly carved scales. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's a reminder," he replied, "that there is always another path." Ernesto, who had been observing the exchange from his chair, nodded with approval, a knowing smile briefly illuminating his emaciated face. That night, before retiring to sleep, Rosie placed the carved snake on a small shelf by the kitchen window, where moonlight bathed it, giving it an almost living appearance. Beside it, as a companion, she put the figure of the horse she had carved for Cole weeks earlier. Together, the two carved animals seemed to maintain a silent conversation, a wooden dialogue that reflected the one developing between their creators. August was sliding toward its end when Cole saw the rider approaching on the eastern road. The mid-afternoon sun drew flashes from the pearl-handled revolver that hung ostentatiously from his hip. Even at a distance, he recognized the tall, slender figure of Silas McCrae, and something cold settled in the pit of his stomach. Cole left, the pitchfork with which he was turning the compost, and walked toward the property boundary, positioning himself to intercept the visitor before he reached the house where Rosie was caring for Ernesto, who had had a bad night. Silas stopped his black horse a few meters away, a twisted smile on his sharp face. Two men followed him at a short distance, hard faces under dusty hats. "Cole Travers," said Silas, his voice soft as worn velvet. "When they told me you had established yourself as a farmer, I had to see it with my own eyes." Cole remained motionless, his posture apparently relaxed, but every muscle tense like the strings of an instrument tuned for violence. "Silas," he responded simply. Cole's former employer dismounted with feline grace, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they touched the ground. He wore an impeccable black suit despite the heat and the long journey, as if dust and sweat were inconveniences that didn't dare touch him. "What a picturesque place," he commented, looking around with barely disguised contempt. "Though I can't say I understand why you would abandon a lucrative life for this." "What do you want, Silas?" asked Cole, keeping his voice level. "Can't I visit an old friend?" Silas pretended to be hurt, a gloved hand over his heart in a theatrical gesture. "Although, now that you mention it, there is a matter that requires your particular skills." Cole perceived movement from the corner of his eye. Rosie had come out to the porch, attracted by the unfamiliar voices. He inwardly cursed. Silas followed his gaze, and his smile widened predatorily upon seeing the young woman. "Ah, now I better understand your choice," he said in a tone that made Cole want to tear out his throat. "You always had a weakness for lost causes, didn't you?" "Say what you came to say and leave," Cole replied, his voice turned to a low growl. Silas took one step closer, lowering his voice so only Cole could hear him. "There's a farmer near Oklahoma who owes me money, a considerable loan he refuses to pay," he explained with false casualness. "I need you to remind him of the consequences of breaking agreements with me." "I don't work for you anymore, Silas." "Nobody stops working for me, Cole." The kindness disappeared from Silas's face, revealing the cold steel underneath. "Especially not someone who knows as much as you do." A tense silence extended between them, loaded with unspoken threats and shared memories that Cole would have preferred to forget. "One more job," continued Silas, his tone returning to false cordiality. "Just one, for old time's sake. I'll pay. You generously, of course." His gaze drifted again toward Rosie, who continued observing from the porch. "You know how things are, Cole. Refusing, that could leave the young lady there very vulnerable. Isolated place like this, you know how it is?" The veiled threat made something primitive stir inside Cole, a monster he thought tamed. He breathed deeply, controlling it. "When?" he asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Silas smiled, satisfied. "Tomorrow itself. I'll send the details. With one of my men tonight." He took an envelope from his jacket and held it out. "An advance, to demonstrate my good faith." Cole took the envelope, his face an impenetrable mask. "Just one more job, Silas." "Of course, old friend," Silas replied, mounting his horse with studied elegance. "Unless you discover that you miss the excitement of our line of work." With a final nod, Silas and his men rode away on the same road they had come, leaving behind a trail of dust and a feeling of unease that clung to the skin like cold sweat. Cole remained motionless until they disappeared from view, the envelope weighing in his hand as if it contained lead instead of money. When he finally turned toward the house, he found Rosie waiting for him on the path, her face a mixture of concern and something that could be disappointment. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Someone from my past," Cole replied, unable to look at her directly. "What did he want?" "Nothing important." Rosie took a step toward him, her chin raised in defiance. "Don't lie to me, Cole Travers. I've seen enough lies to recognize them." Cole remained silent, the envelope crumpling in his closed fist. How could he explain to her who he had been, what he had done for men like Silas? How could he tell her that the man she had begun to open up to, the man who sang with her while they worked the land, had hands stained with blood that no amount of honest work could clean? "I have to leave for a few days," he finally said. "There's something I need to resolve." Rosie studied him, her dark eyes penetrating beyond the unspoken words. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice firm despite the almost imperceptible trembling in her hands. Cole raised his gaze, meeting hers. In that moment, he knew he couldn't lie to her, not to her. "Yes," he replied, with a conviction that surprised him. "I'll come back." Dawn had not yet given way to daybreak when Cole saddled his horse, each movement deliberate and silent, like those of a man preparing for a funeral. The money Silas had given him weighed in his inner pocket, staining the fabric of his shirt, as if it were acid instead of paper. He didn't expect Rosie to be awake, but there she was, a silhouette cut against the fey, that light emanating from the kitchen. She wore a shawl over her shoulders despite the persistent heat of the summer night, and held something in her hands. "I prepared something for your journey," she said, approaching and offering him a package wrapped in cloth. "Bread, cheese, some dried meat." Cole accepted the package, his fingers brushing hers in a brief but electrifying contact. "Thank you," he replied, the word insufficient to express what he felt. Rosie nodded, her eyes avoiding his. There was in her posture a wounded dignity that made Cole hate himself even more. "I won't ask where you're going or what you'll do," she finally said, "but I want you to know something." Cole waited, each beat of his heart painfully audible in the dawn silence. "This land has been waiting for you," continued Rosie, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know why or how, but I've felt it since you arrived, as if there were a purpose in you buying it, in you finding us." She raised her gaze then, her eyes bright in the half-light. "So, regardless of what takes you away today, this land will continue waiting for you. And I—" She stopped, the words suspended between them like raindrops that refused to fall. "And you what?" asked Cole, his voice hoarse. "And I will also be waiting," she completed, "but only if you return being the man who has been working this land with me, not the one I saw yesterday in your eyes when that man left." Her words hit Cole harder than any fist. He had seen fear in the eyes of many men, but he had never experienced the fear of disappointing someone whose opinion really mattered to him. "I'm not a good man, Rosie," he said with brutal honesty. "I've done things—" "We've all done things," she interrupted him. "What matters is what we do now with the time we have left." From her pocket, she extracted a small object and pressed it into Cole's hand. The medallion she always wore around her neck, a simple silver cross with intricate engravings that glowed faintly in the darkness. "It was my mother's," she explained. "She said it protects travelers." Cole closed his fingers around the medallion, feeling its weight, its history, the implicit trust in Rosie's gesture. "I can't accept it," he said, trying to return it to her. "I'm not giving it to you," she replied with a small smile. "I'm lending it to you, so you'll have to come back to return it to me." With a fluid movement, he mounted his horse, the medallion, firmly clutched in his fist before putting it in the pocket next to his heart. "I'll come back," he promised, the words sounding like a sacred oath in the stillness of the imminent dawn. Rosie nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "We'll be waiting. For you. The land and I." Cole rode eastward, where the sky was beginning to clear in orange and purple tones. He didn't look back, but he felt Rosie's presence like a tangible force against his back, anchoring him to a promise he had no intention of breaking. The road to Oklahoma stretched before him like a river of dust, each mile separating him from the peace he had begun to find and bringing him closer to a past he thought he had left behind. But as he rode, a plan began to form in his mind. He would not be the man Silas expected him to be. Not this time. Not ever again. Rosie's medallion seemed to pulse against his chest, a constant reminder that he now had something worth fighting for, something worth changing for. And with each strike of his horse's hooves against the dry earth, his resolution strengthened. The crossroads he had been avoiding for years had finally arrived. And this time he would choose the right path, regardless of the cost. The farm of the man Silas McCrae wanted to intimidate turned out to be a desolate but dignified place. A modest house, wheat fields undulating under the morning wind, and a farmer with a weathered face and clear eyes who showed no surprise when Cole dismounted in front of his property. "I suppose McCrae finally sent someone," said the man, wiping his hands on a cloth as he observed Cole with a resignation that spoke of sleepless nights waiting precisely for this visit. "Joseph Miller, right?" asked Cole, leaving his horse's reins loose, a deliberate gesture to show he wasn't planning a quick exit. The man nodded, squaring his shoulders like someone preparing to receive an inevitable blow. "Do you want to come inside?" "My wife is in town, but I can offer you coffee." The invitation surprised Cole. It wasn't the reception he expected for someone sent by Silas. "I prefer that we talk here," he replied, gesturing toward the porch. In plain sight, they sat in two worn chairs that had known better years, the silence extending between them like a cautious animal. Cole observed the property. He saw signs of hard work, of constant struggle against drought and debts, but he also saw pride in every repaired fence, in every clean window. "McCrae says you owe him money," he finally said. Miller let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what he says?" "I took a loan, yes. After the bank denied me help when we lost the crop to drought." His eyes darkened with the memory. "But I've been paying, every month without fail. It's just that he changes the terms. The interest increases. Fees appear that were never mentioned." Cole nodded. He knew Silas's tactics well. He had witnessed them too many times, sometimes as a silent observer, other times as the instrument that ensured compliance. "How much do you have left to pay according to the original terms?" Miller looked at him with surprise, as if he hadn't expected that question. $75, he replied. "But he says it's now $200, with interest and penalties." Cole put his hand in his jacket and took out the envelope Silas had given him. He opened it and counted the money. $100, the price of a clean job. "Here's 75, he said, separating the bills and placing them on the rustic table between them. "Pay McCrae, get a receipt, and then never deal with him again." Miller looked at the money as if it were a snake that might bite him. "Why would you do this? What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Cole replied, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he felt the lightness of simple truth. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." The farmer hesitated, but finally took the money, his calloused fingers closing over the bills as if he feared they would disappear. "McCrae is not a man who accepts being crossed," he said, a subtle tremor in his voice. "He'll send someone else, if you don't do your job." "I know," Cole replied, standing up. "That's why I have to take care of McCrae." From his saddlebag, he extracted a carefully tied package. Letters, receipts, a small account book he had kept for years. Evidence of Silas's dirty business, fraudulent loans, threats, even 2 murders he had ordered, but that had never been linked. "To him. I'm going to send this to the U.S. Marshal in Abilene," he explained, "but I need you to testify if the time comes." Miller observed the package with a mixture of fear and hope. That could be dangerous. "Living under the shadow of men like McCrae is always dangerous," Cole replied. "At least this way there's a possibility of freedom." Before leaving, Cole wrote on a piece of paper the address of the property in Dustwater. "If something happens, to me," he said, handing it to Miller, "look for Rosie Delgado. Tell her I tried." Miller solemnly nodded, keeping the paper as if it were a testament. "May God go with you, Mr. Travers," Cole replied. "Cole Travers, the gunslinger." Miller's eyes widened with recognition. Cole mounted his horse, the weight of Rosie's medallion against his chest, reminding him of his promise. "Not anymore," he said simply, and set off toward the nearest post office where he would send the package that could seal his own fate, but that could also finally free him from the chains of his past. During the return journey, each mile seemed to bring him not only closer to Dustwater, but to a version of himself that he was just beginning to recognize. A version that, perhaps, would deserve the look of respect in Rosie's eyes, the peace of the land they had worked together, the possibility of a future he never thought possible for someone like him. The silver medallion against his chest seemed lighter now, as if the burden he had carried for so many years finally began to lighten with each decision that took him away from what he had been and brought him closer to what he could be. The afternoon was well advanced when Cole spotted in the distance the familiar contours of the property in Dustwater. The sun was leaning toward the horizon, painting the sky in tones of orange and purple that reflected in the windows of the house like still flames. His heart accelerated at the sight, a strange feeling that he recognized after a moment of confusion as that of returning home. As he approached, he noticed subtle changes. The front fence had been completely repaired, a small herb garden had emerged next to the kitchen entrance, and the smoke rising from the chimney spoke of life and permanence. Cole dismounted slowly, his muscles protesting after days of riding. Before he could call out, the door opened and Rosie appeared on the threshold, her figure silhouetted against the warm light from inside. For a moment, both remained motionless, like figures in a daguerreotype, captured in a suspended instant. Of time. It was Rosie who broke the immobility, descending the porch steps with measured steps that gradually transformed into a run. When she reached him, she stopped abruptly as if suddenly doubting, as if fearing that the man before her was not the same who had departed days ago. "You came back," she said, the words halfway between statement and question. Cole nodded, extracting from his pocket the silver medallion she had entrusted to him. "I promised you." "Sas," he replied, offering it in the open palm of his hand. Rosie looked at the medallion but didn't take it. Instead, she closed Cole's hand over it. "Keep it," she said. "At least until you're sure that your path will bring you back here every time." Something in her gesture, in the implicit trust of her words, untied a knot inside Cole, one that had been so tight for so long that he had almost forgotten its existence. Without thinking, he stepped forward and embraced her, his arms surrounding her with a gentleness that contrasted with his strength, as if he feared she might break, or worse, vanish. Rosie tensed for an instant, surprised, but then relaxed against him, her own arms finding their place around Cole's waist, her head naturally resting against his chest, right where the medallion lay. They remained that way, in silence, words unnecessary as the sun sank behind the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. It was a new language for both, one made of proximity, warmth, and heartbeats that gradually found a shared rhythm. When they finally separated, something fundamental had changed between them. The very air seemed charged with unexpressed possibilities. "How is your father?" asked Cole as they walked together toward the house. A shadow crossed Rosie's face. "He's had better days," she replied, "but he was glad when I told him you had returned." In the kitchen, the oil lamp cast a circle of golden light on the table where they had shared so many meals. Cole noticed that his place was still there, waiting for him, as if Rosie had never doubted his return. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" she asked as she served a plate of stew she had kept warm on the stove. Cole considered the question as he took a seat. The aroma of the stew, rich and comforting, enveloped him like an embrace. "I did what I had to do," he finally replied, "not what was expected of me." Rosie nodded, as if that cryptic answer contained all the information she needed. "Sometimes," she said, sitting across from him, "the right path is the one no one expects us to take." They ate in comfortable silence, exchanging occasional glances that communicated more than any conversation. Afterward, Cole told her about his journey, omitting the darkest details, but sharing the essence of his decision, of how he had chosen to help instead of harm, of how he had sent evidence that could free not only Miller, but many others from Silas McRae's clutches. "Do you think it will work?" asked Rosie, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "I don't know," Cole replied honestly, "but I had to try." Rosie extended her hand across the table, her fingers brushing his in a gesture that had become familiar, and yet still caused a current of warmth that ran through his entire body. "That's all anyone can do," she said. "Try." The rest is beyond our control. That night, as he prepared to sleep in the small room he had begun to consider as his own, Cole found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't done in years. Not with fear or resignation, but with cautious hope. Perhaps, he thought as his eyes closed, perhaps that land and that woman were not simply a temporary refuge, but the beginning of something that could last. Something that, for the first time in his life, was worth protecting not with violence but with love. September arrived with an unexpected sweetness, the temperatures moderating enough to make daily work less exhausting. The land, which once seemed so hostile to Cole, now unfolded before him like a familiar text that he learned to read a little better each day. The small shoots had become robust plants that promised a modest but significant harvest for the fall. One morning, as Cole repaired the barn roof, he saw in the distance a cloud of dust on the road approaching the property. He descended quickly, an unsettling presentiment settling in the pit of his stomach. When he entered the house to alert Rosie, he found her helping Ernesto to sit in his favorite rocking chair on the porch, a blanket over his legs despite the heat. "Someone's coming," said Cole, his eyes finding Rosie's in a silent message of caution. She nodded, understanding. "Father, stay here," she said firmly, kissing Ernesto's wrinkled forehead before following Cole to the front of the property. It wasn't Silas McCrae who approached, but a man of official appearance mounted on a well-groomed horse. His U.S. Marshal badge shone in the sun when he dismounted, adjusting his hat in a gesture of respect toward Rosie. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted, before directing his gaze to Cole. "Mr. Travers?" Cole stepped forward, subtly positioning himself in front of Rosie in a protective gesture that she noticed but didn't comment on. "That's me." The marshal, a middle-aged man with eyes that spoke of having seen too much, extracted an envelope from his jacket. "We received your package," he said without preamble. "Impressive collection of evidence you have there, Mr. Travers." Cole maintained his neutral expression, though his heart was beating strongly. "And? Silas McCrae was arrested yesterday in Abilene," the marshal replied. "His two main collaborators as well. The trial will be in 2 weeks." A sigh involuntarily escaped from Rosie's lips. Cole felt her fingers brush his, a light but significant touch. "We'll need your testimony, of course," continued the marshal, handing him the envelope. "Here is the official summons. We've also contacted Mr. Miller. It seems he's not the only farmer with stories about McCrae." Cole took the envelope, the thick paper weighing in his hand like a sentence and an absolution. Simultaneously, "I'll be there," he replied. The marshal nodded, his gaze assessing Cole with a mixture of respect and caution. "I've heard stories about you, Travers," he said. "Not all good." "Most are probably true," Cole replied without evasion. "Maybe," the marshal adjusted his hat again. "But a man who risks his life to testify against someone like McCrae, that man deserves a second chance, in my opinion." With a final nod, the marshal mounted his horse. "See you in Abilene, Mr. Travers." "Ma'am," he added, inclining his head toward Rosie before departing. When the rider once again became a cloud of dust in the distance, Rosie took Cole's hand in hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that already felt as natural as breathing. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Cole looked at the envelope in his free hand, then at Rosie, and finally toward the land that stretched before them, with its promises of growth and renewal. "Yes," he replied, and for the first time in years, the word didn't feel like a lie. "I think I am." That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Cole found Ernesto alone on the porch, his gaze lost in the horizon. He sat beside him, the silence extending between them like a bridge. "My daughter loves you," Ernesto finally said, his voice as fragile as the dry leaves that the wind dragged across the yard. "She doesn't say it, but I see it in her eyes." Cole didn't respond immediately, allowing the words to settle in him like seeds in fertile ground. "I don't deserve her love," he finally said. Ernesto let out a weak laugh that transformed into a cough. "No man deserves the love of a woman like my Rosie," he replied when he regained his breath. "But she chooses who to give her heart to, and she has chosen you." He turned to Cole, his dark eyes shining with a lucidity that contrasted with the fragility of his body. "I ask only one thing of you," he continued, That you love her like this land, with patience, with constancy, respecting her cycles and her seasons. Without forcing, without hurting, Cole felt a knot in his throat, the words trapped behind it. "I will," he finally managed to say. "I promise." Ernesto nodded, apparently satisfied. Then, with slow and painful movements, he removed a ring from his ring finger, a simple gold band with a small engraving of intertwined leaves. "It was my father's and his father's before him," he said, offering it to Cole. "It should pass to my son, but God didn't grant me one. Now I realize that perhaps it was waiting for you to arrive." Cole looked at the ring with amazement, unable to speak. "Take it," insisted Ernesto. "Not to use it now, but for when the right moment comes, for when you're ready to root yourself completely in this land, with my daughter." With trembling hands, Cole accepted the ring, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. "Thank you," he said, the word insufficient for the magnitude of the gesture. Ernesto looked back at the horizon, where the sun dyed the sky gold and crimson. "Do you know what's the hardest thing about dying?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not the pain nor the fear of the unknown. It's the worry for those we leave behind." Cole remained silent, respecting the vulnerability of the moment. "But now," continued Ernesto, "now I can go in peace, knowing she won't be alone, that she'll have someone who will watch over her, who will work this land with the same love that we have given it." The evening light bathed his face, softening the marks that illness and time had left on him, returning to him for an instant the appearance of the strong man he once was. "Thank you for that, Cole Travers," he finally said. "Thank you for allowing me that last comfort." Cole put the ring in his pocket next to Rosie's medallion, feeling that both objects formed part of a legacy he hadn't sought, but that he now embraced with all his being. A legacy of love, land, and promises that for the first time in his life he intended to fulfill. The journey to Abilene for Silas McCrae's trial meant 3 days of absence, during which Cole felt the distance from the farm as a physical pain, a longing he had never experienced during his years of wandering. Testifying before the judge and jury, feeling Silas's venomous eyes on him as he related years of dirty business, threats and manipulations, was a trial by fire that he went through with the image of Rosie and the land he now considered his home firmly anchored in his mind. When he finally returned, he found Rosie waiting for him on the porch, as if she had been watching the road for hours. She didn't run to meet him this time, but remained there, her eyes following him as he dismounted and tied his horse, her posture revealing a mixture of relief and something deeper that Cole was just beginning to recognize. "How was it?" she asked when he climbed the steps. "McCrae was found guilty," Cole replied. 20 years in prison, minimum." Rosie nodded, processing the information. "And you? Are you all right?" The question, simple but loaded with genuine concern, touched something deep within Cole. No one in years had really cared about his well-being, about how he felt beyond his immediate utility. "I am now," he replied, his eyes finding hers. Something in his gaze must have communicated all he didn't say with words, because Rosie stepped forward and, without hesitation, took his face in her hands, her fingers rough from work tracing invisible, lines along his jaw as if memorizing every angle, every texture. "Welcome home," she said simply. And in those 3 words Cole found a promise of belonging he had never known. The days that followed brought a different rhythm to the farm. Ernesto, whose health fluctuated like a flame in the wind, had increasingly more bad days than good. Cole naturally assumed more responsibilities, not only in the physical work but also in caring for the old man, relieving Rosie so she could rest. At night, while Ernesto slept, Cole and Rosie sat on the porch, sometimes conversing in low voices about the day, the crops, plans for the future. Other times they simply remained in silence, observing the stars, their hands finding each other in the space between the chairs, fingers intertwined in a silent intimacy that expressed more than any word. It was during one of those quiet nights when Rosie spoke of the future in a way that made Cole's heart race. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice blending with the night sounds of crickets and wind among the trees, "that maybe we could expand the house in spring. Add a room on the west side." Cole looked at her, her profile cut against the starry sky, beautiful in its simplicity. "A room?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "For the future," she replied, her gaze finding his with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "For what we might become together." The air between them seemed to charge with electricity, like before a storm. Cole felt the weight of Ernesto's ring in his pocket, where he had carried it since the old man had given it to him. He hadn't mentioned it to Rosie, waiting for the right moment, a moment that perhaps had just arrived. Before he could speak, however, a noise from inside the house caught their attention. Rosie jumped up, recognizing the sound. Ernesto coughing violently. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Ernesto's cough gave way to a high fever that left him semi-conscious, murmuring incoherent words in Spanish that Rosie translated with tears in her eyes. Cole rode to Dustwater in the middle of the night to bring the doctor, who, after examining the old man, could only offer comfort and laudanum for the pain. "He won't last the night," the doctor said quietly to Cole, as Rosie remained by her father's bed, holding his hand. "I'm sorry." Cole thanked the doctor and accompanied him to the door. When he returned to the room, he found Ernesto surprisingly lucid, his feverishly bright eyes fixed on Rosie. "Sing me your mother's song," he asked in Spanish, words that Cole had learned to understand in the shared months. Rosie began to sing, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength, a simple lullaby that spoke of watchful angels and sweet dreams. Cole remained at the threshold, feeling he was witnessing something sacred, a farewell ritual as old as humanity itself. When the song ended, Ernesto smiled weakly and extended his free hand toward Cole, inviting him to approach. "Take care of her," he said when Cole took his hand, the words a sigh more than a sound. "Take care of our land." "I will," promised Cole, his voice firm despite the knot in his throat. "With my life." Ernesto nodded, apparently satisfied, and closed his eyes. His breathing became slower, more shallow, until finally, with an almost imperceptible sigh, it ceased completely. Rosie didn't cry immediately. She remained seated, holding her father's hand, singing softly, as if he could still hear her. Cole stayed by her side, a silent presence offering his strength without imposing it. It was only at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, that Rosie finally let the tears flow. Cole held her then, his arms surrounding her as she cried against his chest, her body shaken by sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her being. "You're not alone," he murmured against her hair, the words a promise he intended to fulfill for the rest of his life. "You'll never be alone." They buried Ernesto under the great oak that marked the western boundary of the property, his favorite place to watch the sunset. Cole dug the grave while Rosie prepared the body, dressing him in his best shirt, placing between his hands the rosary that had belonged to her mother. There was no formal service, just Rosie reading passages from a worn Bible in Spanish, her voice clear despite the pain, and Cole offering simple but heartfelt words about the man who had welcomed him into his home and his family when he had no reason to do so. When they finished, Cole took Rosie's hand, and together they returned to the house that now seemed too big, too silent. But as they walked, the sun shone on the fields where the corn was beginning to ripen, where the land that once seemed dead now brimmed with life. "He is here," said Rosie, her gaze scanning the property. "In every growing plant, in every corner of this land." Cole squeezed her hand, feeling in that simple contact all they had shared and all they still had ahead. The pain and joy, the storms and clear days, the hard work and sweet rewards. "Yes," he replied, "and he always will be." Autumn arrived with a melancholic softness, painting the scarce trees of the property in tones of gold and crimson. Ernesto's absence was a constant presence, an empty space at the table, a rocking chair that moved with the wind on the porch, silent reminders that Rosie and Cole navigated day by day, finding comfort in routine and in each other's company. The Yeon's harvest turned out better than expected. The corn grew tall and strong, the pumpkins rounded under the increasingly mild sun, and the small herb garden Rosie had planted next to the kitchen flourished with an exuberance that seemed to defy the season. They worked together from sun to sun, their bodies moving in harmony born of months of shared labor. Cole's hands, which once had held weapons with lethal skill, now harvested life with the same precision. Rosie's, always strong, but now marked by a new confidence, directed and planned, as if the responsibility inherited after her father's death had awakened in her a renewed determination. At night, exhausted but satisfied, they shared simple dinners in the lamp-lit kitchen, the space between them increasingly comfortable, more intimate. They talked about the future, plans to expand the crops, repair the well, perhaps buy some head of cattle, with a naturalness that made it seem inevitable that they would share that future together. One afternoon, as they put away the tools after a day's work, Cole noticed that Rosie was observing the horizon with a thoughtful expression, her profile outlined against the sunset sky like a painting he wanted to memorize. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, approaching her. Rosie took a moment to respond, her eyes never leaving the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. "About how things change," she said finally. "A year ago this land was dying, my father was getting sick, and I watched everything I loved crumble without being able to do anything." She turned to Cole, the golden light of the sunset illuminating her face, highlighting the strong angles of her cheekbones, the soft curve of her lips. "And then you arrived," she continued, "a stranger who bought our land for $5 and then offered to return it to us, a man with eyes that had seen too much pain but who could still recognize dignity in others." Cole felt a knot in his throat at her words, at the way she saw him, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. "This land saved you as much as you saved it," said Rosie, taking a step toward him. "And me." "You saved me, Rosie," Cole replied, his voice rough with contained emotion. "You and this land, you gave me a purpose when I was just existing." The space between them reduced, attracted to each other like planets in inevitable orbit. Cole's hands, hesitant, rested on Rosie's waist, while hers found their way to his shoulders, closing the circle they had been tracing since that first encounter on the porch, with a shotgun between them and distrust in their eyes. "I love you," said Cole, the words emerging with a simplicity that made them even more powerful. "And I want to spend the rest of my life here, with you, taking care of this land." Rosie's eyes shone with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant, like the setting sun behind them. "I love you too, Cole Travers," she replied, "and I can't imagine this life without you by my side." When they finally kissed, it was as if the earth itself sighed beneath their feet, as if the wind among the cornfields sang a song that only they could hear, a kiss that tasted of fulfilled and future promises, of shared and overcome pain. Oh, gave a life that neither had believed possible, but that now stretched before them like the fertile fields that unfolded in all directions. That night, under a starry sky that seemed to lean down to listen, Cole took out the ring that Ernesto had entrusted to him, and kneeling before Rosie on the porch where once she had received him with distrust, formally asked her to be his wife. "This ring belonged to your grandfather and to his father before him," he explained, the silver gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "Your father gave it to me before he departed. He said it was waiting for me to arrive." Rosie took the ring with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing it. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears that cleansed instead of drowning, that healed instead of hurting. "He said yes," she murmured, as if speaking to her father's spirit. "You were right." With a smile that illuminated the night, she allowed Cole to slide the ring onto her finger, a symbol of continuity, of roots that extended toward the past and branches that rose toward the future. The kiss they shared then sealed more than a commitment between two people. It sealed a promise to the land that had united them, to the memories they had built together, and to those yet to be created. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the sky itself wanted to celebrate the union. October had tinted the landscape with its warm tones, and a gentle breeze rocked the mature cornfields surrounding the property, whispering secrets that only the earth knew. Rosie prepared in the room she had shared with her mother during her childhood, wearing a simple white dress she had made with fabrics purchased in town. It wasn't elaborate or ostentatious, but in its simplicity, It carried the same dignity and natural beauty that characterized its wearer. The hands that arranged her hair in a braided crown with wildflowers belonged to Maria Gonzalez, a neighbor, who had been a friend of her mother and who had come from her ranch 15 miles away to help on this special day. "Your mother would be so proud," said Maria, her eyes finding Rosie's in the small cracked mirror. "And your father too." Rosie nodded, feeling their presence like a comforting warmth around her. "I know," she replied, her fingers brushing the medallion that she had once lent to Cole and that now hung again from her neck. "Somehow I feel they are here." Maria smiled, placing the last flower in the braid. "They are, child, in every corner of this land, in every beat of your heart." Meanwhile, Cole waited beside the great oak under which Ernesto rested. He wore his only good shirt, freshly washed and ironed, and black pants that had seen better days, but that Rosie had mended with loving care. His hair, normally disheveled, was combed back, and his beard had been precisely trimmed. Beside him, the justice of the peace from Dustwater reviewed his notes for the ceremony, while the few guests, neighbors, the doctor who had attended Ernesto, even Joseph Miller, who had traveled from Oklahoma with his family, gathered in a semicircle under the dancing shade of the oak. When Rosie appeared on the path leading from the house, a reverent silence fell over the assembly. She walked alone, with her head high, and a serene smile that illuminated her face from within. In her hands she carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers, harvested that very morning from the meadow that she and Cole had sown together in spring. Cole felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight of her advancing toward him, not with the trembling uncertainty of a bride, but with the steady determination of a woman who has chosen her path and walks it with absolute conviction. When she reached his side, she took his hand as she had done so many times before, in the Ait field, in the kitchen, on the porch under the stars. But this time the gesture carried the weight of a promise they were about to formalize before the eyes of all. The ceremony was brief and simple, the traditional words resonating under the branches of the centennial oak. When the time came to exchange vows, Rosie spoke first, her voice clear and firm like the water of the stream that now flowed constantly after the autumn rains. "Cole Travers, you came into my life like an unexpected storm after a long drought," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You brought rain to parched land, hope where there was only resignation. I give you my heart, my hands and my future, to work together this land that now belongs to both of us, to build something that will endure beyond us." Cole, normally so sparing with words, found his voice strengthened by the sincerity of the moment. "Rosie Delgado, you gave me a home when I didn't deserve it, trust when I only offered doubts, love when I believed I wasn't capable of receiving it." His hands, rough from work but gentle as they held hers, trembled slightly. "I promise you my life, my strength and my heart, to protect what we have built, to nurture what will grow between us, to be the man that you saw in me when I couldn't even see it myself." The exchange of rings, Ernesto's for Rosie, and a simple silver one that Cole had bought in Abilene for himself, sealed the promises pronounced under the watchful gaze of the oak and the infinite Texas sky. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," announced the judge, his voice almost drowned out by the sudden applause from the attendees when Cole and Rosie kissed, a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promises and new beginnings. The celebration that followed was as simple and genuine as the couple themselves. Food shared at long tables set up in the yard, music provided by a neighbor with an accordion and his son with a violin, laughter and conversations that extended until the sun began its descent on the horizon. At nightfall, when the guests had departed and the house was again in silence, Cole and Rosie walked together toward the cornfields. The full moon bathed the landscape in liquid silver, transforming the familiar into something magical, almost supernatural in its beauty. "Do you remember the first time we worked together here?" asked Rosie, her hand firmly intertwined with Cole's. "The earth was so dry it raised dust with every step." Cole nodded, remembering those first days of silent work, of slowly built trust. "And now look at it," she continued, her voice full of wonder, alive, fertile, promising sustenance for the years to come. They stopped in the middle of the cornfield. the tall plants surrounding them like silent sentinels. Cole took Rosie's face between his hands, the moonlight reflecting in her dark eyes like twin stars. "Like us," he said simply. Rosie smiled, understanding all that those two words contained: a reclaimed past, a celebrated present, a future embraced with hope and determination. There, in the middle of the field they had worked together, they shared a kiss that sealed not only their union as husband and wife, but as guardians of a land that had saved them as much as they had saved it. A kiss that tasted of fertile earth, of fulfilled promises, of roots that sank deeply and branches that extended toward an infinite sky of possibilities. In the house they now fully shared, Cole's old revolver hung forgotten on a nail by the door, a relic of a past that no longer defined his present, nor would dictate his future. Beside it, the snake and the horse carved in wood maintained their silent conversation, symbols of a shared language that had been born between two seemingly disparate but fundamentally connected souls, and on the horizon, beyond the cultivated fields and repaired fences, the future unfolded like a blank canvas, waiting to be painted with the colors of a shared life, a beloved land, and a story that was just beginning to be written.